How the USSR stopped the Nazis. The snow fell like ash over the ruins of Stalingrad, each flake settling on broken stone and frozen earth with a silence that felt almost sacred. It was the winter of 1942, and the city that bore Stalin's name had become a graveyard where two empires came to measure their will against the abyss. A young Soviet soldier named Mikhail Petrov crouched in what remained of a factory wall, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air, his rifle clutched against his chest like a talisman against the cold and the certainty of death. He had not eaten a full meal in 3 days. The bread ration that morning had been little more than sawdust pressed into the shape of sustenance. Yet when he looked across the shattered landscape toward the German positions, he felt something harder than hunger, something that had been forged in the furnaces of desperation and tempered by a resolve that came from depths he had not known existed within himself. This was not where the story began, though it was perhaps where the world first truly understood what the Soviet Union was capable of enduring. To understand how the Red Army stopped the Wehrmacht, how the hammer and sickle held against the swastika's advance, one must travel backward through time to the moment when the darkness first descended, to that summer morning in June of 1941 when the entire western horizon erupted in flame and thunder, when Operation Barbarossa tore through the Soviet frontier like a hurricane of steel and hatred. The German armies came in 3 massive groups, millions of men supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, the most powerful invasion force ever assembled in human history, aimed like a spear at the heart of the Soviet state. They came with the confidence of conquerors who had swept through Poland in weeks, who had brought France to her knees in a single spring, who believed themselves to be the vanguard of a superior civilization destined to claim the vast spaces of the East. In those first weeks, it seemed as though nothing could stop them. Soviet divisions dissolved under the onslaught, entire armies encircled and destroyed in vast pincer movements that swallowed hundreds of thousands of men. The roads east filled with refugees, their faces hollow with shock, their belongings piled on carts pulled by exhausted horses or carried on backs bent under the weight of all they could salvage from lives that had been peaceful only days before. The German tanks rolled forward in great columns that stretched to the horizon, their treads churning the summer dust into choking clouds, their commanders reading maps and calculating distances to Moscow with the casual certainty of men who had never known defeat. In Berlin, Hitler spoke of victory within months, of Soviet armies that would crumble like rotten timber, of a people who would welcome their new masters or perish in the flames of a war they could not hope to win. But even as the Wehrmacht advanced, even as the maps in German headquarters showed arrows driving ever deeper into Soviet territory, something was happening that did not fit the calculations of the German High Command. In the forests and swamps of Belarus, in the agricultural heartland of Ukraine, in the approaches to Leningrad and the roads leading to Moscow, the Red Army was learning to fight. The lessons were written in blood, in the bodies of men who died holding positions that could not be held, buying hours and days with their lives while something larger took shape behind them. The Soviet Union was a vast creature wounded but not yet broken, and it was beginning to mobilize resources on a scale that the world had never witnessed. In the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German bombers, factories that had been dismantled in the western regions were being rebuilt, their machinery transported on railway cars in a desperate exodus of industry. Workers labored in shifts that lasted until they collapsed, building tanks and aircraft and artillery pieces with hands that bled and backs that screamed for rest they could not afford to take. The architect of this industrial miracle was a system that had been forged in the brutal crucible of Stalin's 5-year plans. A command economy that could mobilize labor and resources with a ruthlessness that matched the urgency of the moment. Entire cities were devoted to single purposes. Factories operated around the clock, their floors never silent, their furnaces never cold. Women who had never worked metal before found themselves operating lathes and presses, their fingers learning the rhythms of production even as their sons and husbands died at the front. In Tankograd, the great complex at Chelyabinsk, the T-34 medium tanks rolled off assembly lines in numbers that seemed impossible, each one a steel promise that the war could still be won, that Soviet power had not been exhausted by the catastrophes of the summer and autumn. The T-34 itself was a revelation. its sloped armor and wide tracks and powerful gun making it superior to most German tanks of that period. A weapon born from necessity and refined by engineers who understood that their work was the difference between survival and annihilation. Geography became an ally in ways the Germans had not fully anticipated. The distances were immense, swallowing armies whole, stretching supply lines until they snapped under their own weight. The roads, such as they were, turned to mud in the autumn rains. That infamous Rasputitsa that transformed the Russian landscape into an ocean of thick black mire that could swallow trucks and horses and men until nothing remained but the despair of soldiers who had been promised a quick victory and instead found themselves trapped in a hell without end or meaning. The railroads that might have eased the logistics were of a different gauge than those in Europe, requiring the Germans to rebuild or adapt thousands of kilometers of track while their armies waited for supplies that came too slowly or not at all. And then came the winter, that first terrible winter of 1941, arriving early and with a ferocity that froze the oil in engines and the blood in veins, that killed men in their sleep and turned fingers black with frostbite, that stopped the German advance not through Soviet strength but through the simple fact that human beings, even the vaunted soldiers of the WWII, could not function in cold that reached 40 degrees below zero without the equipment and clothing that their leaders had failed to provide because the war was supposed to be over before winter came. Moscow survived that winter not through miracle but through sacrifice measured in lives that could never be counted, never fully honored. Zhukov, the brutal and brilliant marshal who commanded the city's defense, brought in fresh divisions from Siberia, men accustomed to cold, equipped for winter, trained and ready at the moment when the Germans were at their weakest. The counterattack came in December, driving the Wehrmacht back from the capital's gates in the first major defeat Hitler's armies had suffered. It was not a rout, not yet, but it was proof that the invincible machine could bleed, could be stopped, could be pushed backward. The psychological impact rippled through both armies. For the Germans, it was the first shadow of doubt. For the Soviets, it was oxygen, the first deep breath of hope after months of suffocation. Yet hope is a fragile thing when weighed against the machinery of total war. The spring of 1942 brought new German offensives, this time aimed at the south, at the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial centers along the Volga River. The strategic calculus was clear. Germany needed oil to sustain its war machine, and the Soviet Union needed its remaining industrial capacity to continue the fight. Stalingrad became the focal point, a city of strategic importance but also of symbolic weight so heavy that both dictators poured men and material into its streets with a recklessness that bordered on madness. The battle that developed there in the autumn of that year was unlike anything in the annals of warfare. A grinding house-to-house combat where factories became fortresses and every cellar was contested with grenades and bayonets and bare hands. Soldiers fought for individual rooms, for staircases, for heaps of rubble that had once been homes. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad was measured in hours, sometimes minutes. Vasily Chuikov commanded the 62nd Army defending the city, a hard man who understood that the only way to negate German advantages in tanks and aircraft was to fight at such close quarters that those weapons became useless or dangerous to their own side. His soldiers learned to hug the Germans close, to launch attacks in the gaps between artillery barrages, to survive in conditions that would have broken armies with less at stake. They were supplied by boats crossing the Volga under constant fire, bringing ammunition and reinforcements and carrying back the wounded who had any chance of survival. Many boats never made the return journey, sunk by bombs or artillery shells, their cargo of suffering men disappearing into the dark water. The civilian population that had not evacuated lived in cellars and ruins, existing in a twilight world between life and death, their presence a reminder of what was being defended, of the human cost measured not just in soldiers but in the old and young and everyone in between who happened to be in the wrong place when history decided to make that place its stage. While the Germans exhausted themselves in Stalingrad's ruins, Soviet planners were preparing something that would demonstrate the full maturation of their strategic thinking. Operation Uranus was conceived as a massive counteroffensive, a double envelopment that would trap the German Sixth Army inside the city they had been trying so desperately to capture. The plan exploited German overextension, targeting the flanks held by Romanian and Italian units that were less well equipped and less motivated than their German allies. In November, the trap closed with shocking speed and precision. Soviet tank columns broke through the defensive lines and met behind the German positions, encircling over 250,000 men in a pocket from which there would be no escape despite Hitler's orders to hold and promises of relief that would never materialize. The winter closed in again, and this time it was the Germans who starved and froze, who ate their horses and burned their last reserves of ammunition fighting off Soviet attacks that grew stronger while they grew weaker. The surrender came in February 1943, and with it the turning point of the war in the East became undeniable. Field Marshal Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, emerged from his headquarters gaunt and defeated, his army reduced to 90,000 starving men who would march into captivity from which most would never return. The propaganda value was immense, but the strategic reality was even more significant. Germany had lost an entire army, one of its finest, along with the initiative in the east. The Wehrmacht would launch one more great offensive, at Kursk in the summer of 1943, but would fail against Soviet defenses that had been prepared with meticulous care, against tank armies that outnumbered the attackers, against an air force that had learned its trade and now filled the skies with fighters and ground attack aircraft that tore apart German formations before they could reach their objectives. The human element in all of this cannot be reduced to statistics or strategic analyses, though both are necessary to understand the scope. The Soviet people endured losses that defy comprehension. 27 million dead, perhaps more, the number itself uncertain because the chaos of war made precise accounting impossible. Entire cities were erased, villages burned, populations murdered or displaced in numbers that constituted genocide, particularly in the occupied territories where Nazi racial ideology was implemented with systematic cruelty. The siege of Leningrad lasted nearly 900 days, killing perhaps 1 million civilians through starvation and bombardment, yet the city never fell. The endurance required to survive such conditions, to continue fighting and working and resisting when every rational calculation suggested surrender or collapse, speaks to something in the human spirit that transcends ideology or nationalism, something rooted in the desperate will to survive and the equally powerful need to protect what remains of home and family and identity. Stalin's role was complex and contradictory. His purges of the late 1930s had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, executing or imprisoning thousands of experienced commanders just years before they would be desperately needed. His refusal to believe intelligence warnings about the German invasion left Soviet forces unprepared in June 1941. His interference in military operations during the early disasters cost lives and territory. Yet he also provided a ruthless unity of command, a willingness to mobilize total resources, and an ability to delegate authority to capable commanders like Zhukov once the desperate situation made clear that ideological loyalty was not enough to win battles. The Soviet system under Stalin was brutal and inflexible in many ways, but it proved capable of sustained sacrifice and industrial mobilization on a scale that eventually overwhelmed the German war machine. By 1944, the Red Army had become the most powerful land force in the world. It had learned to conduct operations of stunning scale and complexity, coordinating attacks across fronts thousands of kilometers wide, employing tank armies in the kind of deep operations that Soviet military theorists had dreamed of in the 1930s but lacked the means to execute. The liberation of Soviet territory gave way to the advance into Eastern Europe, into Poland and Romania and Hungary, and finally into Germany itself. The brutality that accompanied this advance, the revenge taken for years of occupation and atrocity, created new cycles of suffering that would poison relations between peoples for generations. War is never clean, and total war fought with such hatred and desperation corrodes everything it touches, leaving scars that persist long after the guns fall silent. Berlin fell in the spring of 1945, its streets fought over with the same intensity that Stalingrad had known, the circle closing, the Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years dying in its 12th. Soviet flags were raised over the Reichstag, and soldiers who had survived the journey from Moscow or Stalingrad or Leningrad, who had marched and fought across half a continent, could finally believe that it was over, that they had lived to see the victory purchased with so much blood and suffering. The cost had been almost beyond bearing, but the alternative, the victory of Nazi Germany and the implementation of its genocidal plans for the Slavic peoples of the East, would have been infinitely worse. That is the terrible arithmetic of such conflicts, the choices between catastrophe and annihilation that make heroes of ordinary people and demand from them everything they have and more than they knew they possessed. Mikhail Petrov, if he survived, would have returned to a Soviet Union victorious but devastated, its western regions destroyed, its people traumatized, its future uncertain despite the triumph. The factories in the Urals would continue to operate, now producing goods for reconstruction rather than tanks. The soldiers would come home to find families changed or gone, to cities that needed rebuilding, to a peace that was really just the beginning of a different kind of struggle. But in that moment of victory, in the spring of 1945, none of that mattered quite as much as the simple fact of survival, the knowledge that the darkness had been faced and resisted and finally pushed back. The Soviet Union stopped the Nazis through industry that could outproduce its enemy, through strategy that eventually matched and surpassed German military skill, through geography that provided space to trade for time, and through a sheer endurance of suffering that tested the limits of what human beings can survive and still continue to fight. It was not beautiful, it was not simple, and it came at a cost that still echoes through history. But it was, in the end, enough.